The night was black and cold. Stillness hung heavy over the meadows, farms, and forests surrounding Salem in eastern Massachusetts. Piercing the still night air, an eerie horn blast summoned the witches of eastern Massachusetts to a meeting in the pasture of Salem's pastor, Reverend Samuel Parris. Some of the witches arrived early, lazing about on the green grass. Many witches flew in on sticks, bringing with them godly women that they had kidnapped and intended on converting to their evil witchcraft. Between 70 and 100 witches were in attendance that night. They milled about, anxiously awaiting for their honored guest, the devil himself. He flew in on a black horse. Several demons and witches were with him, sitting on a pole balanced on his shoulders. He was black and wore a high-crowned hat above his fiery red eyes. The devil was there, Alex, and he's not good to you, Victoria. As the witches sat around a long table, the devil instructed them on how to bewitch the people. He told them to do it slowly and not to go too fast, and those people who refused to pledge themselves to the devil would be tormented into submission. He also served his witches his evil sacrament of blood-red wine and red bread. That night, innocent women were forced to sign the devil's book in blood, pledging to be his servant. To cap off the night, the devil performed his evil baptism down in the nearby river, 6 people at a time. That witch meeting did not bode well for the people of Salem or the neighboring towns. The ghosts of the dead began leaving their graves and bringing dire warnings to terrified people. Specters tormented children by biting and stabbing them. Witches transformed themselves into blue pigs, black dogs, and black cats that crashed through windows, attacking people's throats. These weren't cheese cats, Juliana. Witches in invisibility walked among people, causing destruction and terror. Some witches stuck pins in rag dolls or dolls made of wax to torment victims. Houses became haunted. Farm animals behaved strangely, some even killed themselves, and people became sick. Some girls even began vomiting metal nails. Perhaps most foreboding of all, a dark phantom, dressed like a pastor, stalked people at night, making travel perilous. This was more than a witch. This was a wizard or a conjurer with satanic power, one of Satan's lieutenants, a king of hell, as one minister called him. At least, that's what some people testified happened during the Salem Witchcraft Trials of 1692, which prompted one recent historian to say, though hard cider was the drink of choice, still the thoughtful, devout, literate New Englander could in the Salem courtroom at times sound as if he were on a low-grade acid trip. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight in this special podcast in my series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. For the Salem Witchcraft Trials are like a cautionary tale from a children's Halloween book gone horribly wrong. The people of Massachusetts were genuinely afraid that satanic power had invaded their godly commonwealth. But reading the accounts of the trials of the accused witches is just as scary as any of the ghost stories that were told about them. In 1692, from June through the end of September, 19 men and women were executed. One man was crushed to death. Several died in a vile, nasty jail awaiting trial, and 2 dogs thought to be under demonic power were shot. Had the governor not put an end to the proceedings late in October, many more would have certainly been executed. The youngest person arrested was Dorothy Good. She was only 5 years old, while the oldest person arrested was in their 80s. Witchcraft trials were not unique to Puritan New England. All European nations took seriously the biblical injunction found in Exodus 22, verse 18, which says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Parliament had made witchcraft a capital offense in 1542. Thousands of people died in witchcraft trials throughout Europe. England's other North American colonies, such as Virginia and Pennsylvania, had had witchcraft trials. But what made New England so different, especially Connecticut and Massachusetts, was their willingness to accept a wide array of evidence that was almost impossible to defend yourself against, so that once you were accused, it was very hard to convince the court that you were not a witch. In the other colonies, they were much more strict about the kind of evidence they allowed into the courtroom. And in many of the other colonies, people who were accused of being witches filed defamation lawsuits against their accusers. Ironically enough, the Salem Witchcraft Trials begin in the home of the Reverend Samuel Parris. Parris had a daughter named Elizabeth, who was 9 years old, and a cousin living with them named Abigail Williams, who was 11 years old. Like many people at that time, Elizabeth and Abigail liked to dabble in folk magic. In fact, there's one incident where they were putting the white of an egg into a cup of water, and this was a common practice apparently. You could see the face of your future spouse in the image that was created by putting the egg white into water. Instead of seeing the image or the face of their future husbands, Elizabeth and Abigail apparently saw a coffin, or the shape of a coffin, and it frightened them quite a bit. Sometime in January of 1692, Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams began experiencing strange symptoms. They would bark like dogs and hide under tables and chairs. They would fall into trances and complain of illnesses, too, that they couldn't explain. The Reverend Parris had a slave named Tituba who talked the girls into trying a little magic of her own. She took the girls' urine, mixed it with some rye flour to make urine cakes, and then fed it to their dog. It was thought that in some way this would either stop the power of the witch to hurt them that was afflicting them, or might even draw the witch out so they knew who it was. Reverend Parris was furious when he found out that this had happened, and of course it didn't do anything to stop the symptoms they were experiencing, and soon they were joined by a couple of other girls in the neighborhood, one named Ann Putnam and the other Elizabeth Hubbard. On February 24th, Dr. Griggs, although he was hardly really a doctor in the modern sense of the term, but anyway, he came over to try and see if he could help these girls and determined that they were under some kind of possession or demonic spell. In the meantime, these girls had been naming names. They complained that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne had been afflicting them and trying to get them to sign the devil's book. On February 29th, formal complaints were made against Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, and the magistrates brought them in for questioning and to hold them over if there were enough evidence for trial. On March 1st, Sarah Good was questioned by Magistrate John Hawthorne, who was an ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne. I'll say more about him later. I want to read a portion of this question and answering because it's so typical of how all of the proceedings, both at these initial hearings as well as in the courtroom, went. Try and picture the room. Sarah Good has been brought in. The 4 girls accusing her, the hysterical ones, have had seizures that morning, and now they're in that courtroom waiting to accuse her. Hawthorne asks her, "Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with?" She responds, "None." Then Hawthorne says, "Have you made no contract with the devil?" And she responds, "No." He asks, "Why do you hurt these children?" Her response was, "I do not hurt them. I scorn it." Hawthorne asks, "Who do you employ then to do it?" Her response was, "I employ nobody." Hawthorne then asked, "What creature do you employ then?" Her answer was, "No creature, but I am falsely accused." At this point, the magistrate Hawthorne asked the 4 girls to look at Sarah Good and to make sure that there was no mistake in their identity. They had been claiming that she had coming to them, or at least her specter was, and tormenting them. Sarah Good then denied that she had been anywhere near their houses at any of those times. After her denial, the girls then went into their hysterical act. The magistrates noted that the girls were all dreadfully tortured and tormented, and the girls claimed that the spirit of Sarah Good was lunging at them from her body, even though she was some distance away from them physically. At this point, Hawthorne then asked Sarah Good again, saying, "Do you not see now what you have done? Why do you not tell us the truth? Why do you thus torment these poor children?" Sarah Good then responds, "I do not torment them." Hawthorne again asks, "Who do you employ then?" Sarah Good answers, "I employ nobody. I scorn it." Hawthorne then asks her again, "How came they thus tormented?" After watching the girls writhing for a few more moments and after a few more questions, Sarah Good then decides to point the finger at one of the other people that had been accused. When Hawthorne asks her again, "Who was it then that tormented the children?" Sarah Good answered, "It was Osborne," meaning Sarah Osborne. I read this portion of this hearing because it's so typical of how all of the proceedings and the courtroom proceedings went. You had questions that already assumed the guilt of the accused person. You had the hysterical behavior of these girls, and there was always a crowd there to witness the spectacle of the witchcraft trials. It would have been very frightening to be accused. Sarah Osborne and Tituba, the slave belonging to the Reverend Parris, were also questioned, and it went pretty much the same way as it had with Sarah Good. At first, Tituba denied being a witch, but she soon changed her tune and confessed that she was a witch. Now, Tituba, being a slave, it's easy to see why she might confess. She could be horribly abused or punished by her owner, although we don't know for certain if that happened or not, or that if he wanted her to confess, it might have been an embarrassment to his household to have a witch living with him. After all, he was the Reverend. it is a question as to why so many people who were accused of witchcraft ended up confessing. And the answer is it was a strategic move to save their lives. Most of the people who confessed, their lives were spared. Confessing didn't spare you necessarily all the difficulties that came with it. For instance, it was a taint on your family forever, and it was assumed back then that witchcraft ran in families. If your mother was a witch, it was highly suspect that you might be a witch as well. Confessing to be a witch also increased the likelihood that you would be accused again. Many of the people that were accused of witchcraft had been previously accused of witchcraft. And heaven help you if a neighbor's cow died or something strange happened to them, they might get around to suspecting you had something to do with it with your witchcraft. You also face the possibility of being excommunicated from your church, which kind of puts you into a situation of social ostracization. So confession was not without its risks, but at least it would save your life. One of the things that people have been trying to figure out for over 300 years now is what drove these girls to do what they were doing. We've talked about the 4 already, but they were joined by many more. And the drama didn't just happen in the courtroom. It would sometimes happen at church. They would claim to be seeing things and the spirits of others tormenting them there, and it also happened at home. If you think about what they were doing, or the accusations they were making and what it could lead to, what they were doing was really quite vicious. So exactly what made them do it? There have been many different theories to try and explain it. Some have suggested that the food they were eating had fungus on it that created psychotic symptoms. Other theories claim that they were just simply bored. Puritan life was not easy. It was hierarchical and very rigid. Their lives were very regimented. There were no holidays on a Puritan calendar, so it would have been very boring. Maybe they were just bored. Maybe it was a means of control. If you think about what they were able to get away with, the magistrates always seemed to believe these girls and never seemed to really question what they were doing. They were also able to get away with it at church. It was actually illegal and punished by a fine to interrupt church services, and here they were doing it frequently during this whole witchcraft trial episode. One of the things that many of these girls had in common was that they had experienced quite a bit of trauma as young girls. They had been raised in Maine, which was part of Massachusetts at that time, and witnessed atrocities committed by the Indians against their families. Many of them were the only remaining family member from their families that had survived, and they were now maidservants in the homes of the other people. And in a society that was so rigidly hierarchical, they probably didn't feel like they had much prospect for a future. I mentioned the trauma they encountered growing up as young children. I'll explain 1 or 2 incidents that occurred in Maine. At that time, Maine was being settled. Like I said, it was part of Massachusetts. It was a wild frontier, and the French wanted it and claimed it, and they were stirring up Indians to do raids there. In one raid, the townspeople fled into a fort to be safe. One unlucky man didn't make it. He was caught by the Indians, and he was scalped and castrated. His fingers and toes were split, and then the Indians shoved burning coals into the splits. And this was all done in sight of everyone in the fort who could see it. And certainly some of the children would have known about this or even witnessed it. One of the girls involved in the accusations, her name was Mercy Short. She was captured along with many other people and carried off by the Indians. And during their trek through the woods, she witnessed one of the other girls being beheaded by the Indians, and they held up the head as a reminder of what would happen to them if they tried to escape. She was also tied up and forced to watch as they chopped up a young boy. She was forced to watch all this. So certainly these traumatic events would have left scars on these young girls. None of them ever came forward later and explained why they did it, so it's still kind of a mystery. One other important factor that has to be pointed out, at the time that the witchcraft scare began, Massachusetts had no legally constituted government. The previous king had abolished their charter, and the new king, William, had sent the charter that was en route, but it wouldn't arrive there for some time. So these magistrates that were questioning these accused persons really questionably had no legal authority to do so. It's just that the government kind of went on as it had before the charter was revoked there in Massachusetts. When a person confessed to being a witch, they were pressured greatly by the judges and the magistrates to now name names because it was assumed they all knew each other and they knew who else was involved in the witchcraft. This is one of the reasons why so many people were arrested and accused of witchcraft. They all started pointing fingers at each other. The jail in Salem became full so quickly that they had to start moving accused witches to the jail in Boston. It's hard to really express how foul these jails were. They had no running water. They didn't have a system of ventilation that was very good. In fact, it was said in Boston that the smell of the jail could be stifling and you could smell it quite a ways away. To add insult to injury, you had to pay fines or fees for your upkeep in the jail. Even after you were let out, you couldn't leave until you paid them. So this is not like a 4-star hotel you're having to pay for. It was pretty nasty, and you're expected to pay for it. Once you were arrested, the corrupt local sheriff, a man named George Corwin, who was related to the magistrates, would probably go out and start plundering your farm under the pretense that he wanted to make sure there was enough provisions or other things that could be sold to make sure to pay for your upkeep in jail. And of course, he kept a lot of stuff of it on his own, and he was not above taking bribes either. I mentioned Tituba, the slave that belonged to Reverend Paris, earlier. She was one of the first people to be thrown in jail and one of the last to be let out. And the reason was she had no way of paying her fees for staying there, and the Reverend didn't want her back, so he left her in there, and she ended up being sold instead. As the accusations mounted, the local constable, John Willard, whose job it was to arrest the accused persons, simply refused to do so anymore. I think he started early on to see that something was gone wrong here. He ended up fleeing, and he was brought back, and it was assumed back then that if you had fled, you must have something to hide. And not surprisingly, he was accused of being a witch, and he was found guilty and executed, along with the other witches he had arrested. The new charter that the king had signed and sent over finally arrived, and it named Sir William Phips as the new governor. William Phips created a special court of oyer and terminer, which in modern English simply means a court to hear and determine, to begin trying all the witchcraft cases that had erupted around Salem, and he appointed his deputy governor, William Stoughton, as the chief justice of the court. In a letter to the king, Governor Phips said, "I found this province miserably harassed by a most horrible witchcraft or possession of devils, which had broke in upon several towns. Some scores of poor people were taken with preternatural torments, some were scalded with brimstone, some had pins stuck into their flesh, others were hurried into fire and water, and some dragged out of their houses and carried over the tops of trees and hills for many miles together." So in late May, this special court of oyer and terminer began hearing cases. We can only imagine how an accused person felt. They had no defense counsel with them. It was assumed that if they were innocent, they didn't need anyone to help them. They were probably weakened by staying in a foul jail. They were probably torn out. Their clothes were worn out. They were probably worn out with worry. And on top of it all, they were facing a court that presumed their guilt. And in the end, how do you prove that your ghost wasn't going around torturing people or damaging their farm animals? One of the things that made the Salem Witchcraft Trials so different from the trials in many of the other colonies, and so harrowing for people that were accused, was the kinds of evidence they were allowing in. For example, it was assumed that witches had little helpers that helped them, called familiars. These were like little demons or little imps or other creatures that would help them do their work. It was also assumed that witches nursed these little imps by having little teats or special nipples somewhere on their body that they could nurse them with. And so as part of the trials, many of the accused people were strip searched by special juries of their same gender who were set about searching their bodies for special marks, the devil's mark, or these special little nipples. And heaven help you if you happen to have a strange mole or some other growth on your body. It was very invasive too. One woman who was strip searched, they happened to find something special about her genitalia. She protested, explaining that during childbirth she had special scarring, but apparently the court bought the evidence and that this was a special nipple or teat for nursing imps or demons that were assisting her as a witch. It's hard to imagine something so ridiculous. How do these jurors even know what to look for as they're searching your body? Another type of evidence was provided by what we call the touch test. When you came into the courtroom, the girls that we mentioned earlier would immediately go into their histrionics, falling on the floor and flailing and accusing you of attacking them. They would act like they were in great agony. It was assumed that the witch emitted poisonous particles into the victim through their eyes. And so by touching the victim, the accusers, you could draw the poison out of them and calm them down. So some of the accused witches, when they would come into the room, the girls would go into their histrionics. They would blindfold the accused person on the pretense that they didn't want their evil eye emitting more particles, poisonous particles, into these victims, would go and touch the girls. They would place their hands on them, and then the girls, of course, automatically calm down. Now, to me, it seems they have this backwards. I think they should have blindfolded the accusers to see if they could identify which one had touched them, to see if it had relieved their suffering. But common sense and logic were never a part of the Salem witch trials. Some people were tortured into giving evidence. For example, two brothers, Richard and Andrew Carrier, whose mother, Martha, was arrested and later executed. They were tied upside down, face down on the ground, until blood ran out their noses, and they finally started confessing and giving names. And of course, since when has torture ever been an effective way of getting honest information out of someone? People will do anything to get rid of the pain they're feeling. Another man named Giles Corey, who could see the way these witchcraft trials were going, he refused to enter a plea at court. And so what they did is they tied him to the ground, they put planks on him, and then started piling rocks on top of him until he would enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. He knew if he entered either plea, he would lose his estate, and so he decided not to give any plea at all, and he died after a few days of being crushed to death under these stones. Sadly, his wife, who had already been convicted of being a witch, was executed a few days later. But at least Mr. Corey saved his estate, and it passed on to his children, and it wasn't confiscated by the government because they couldn't prove he was a witch. Other people who were accused simply fled. Many of them fled to New York, outside the jurisdiction of the witchcraft trials. One such person was a wealthy merchant named Philip English. He and his wife Mary fled, probably with the help of some of the local clergy that were sympathetic, and he went to New York. And of course his farm was plundered by the corrupt sheriff that we mentioned earlier. When the witchcraft trials were over, Philip English and his wife came back, and they immediately initiated litigation to get back some of the things that the sheriff had stolen from his farm. And as kind of a payback, he donated a bunch of land nearby to establish one of the first Anglican churches in the area, because he was Anglican, he wasn't Puritan. So he got a little bit of payback and maybe some satisfaction too. One of the most controversial types of evidence, and one that caused a lot of people uneasiness, was spectral evidence. This was evidence given by eyewitnesses who claimed that people's ghosts or spirits had left their body and were now tormenting them or causing them troubles or trying to force them to sign the devil's book. This not only happened in private, but sometimes the group of hysterical girls that we've commented on or talked about would claim even during the court proceedings to see a person's ghost or specter lunging at them, even though the person was on the other side of the room. And it happened at church too. Sometimes these girls would claim to see the specter or ghost of someone up in the rafters or in other places. Now, apparently when these girls got going talking about spectral evidence or describing the ghost, it must have been quite a convincing performance, because the Attorney General, Thomas Newton, after witnessing this, mentioned, "I have beheld the most strange things, scarce credible but to the spectators." So maybe it could be quite convincing to people that watched it, but reading about it or hearing about it today, we just laugh at the whole thing. Now, there were a lot of court trials that went on during the summer of 1692, and executions as well. I'm just going to describe a few of the incidents to kind of give you the flavor of how some of the courtroom antics went. In the case of Elizabeth Carey, during her trial, she was forced to stand with her hands outstretched and her head twisted away from the girls because they claimed that she was tormenting them, and that it was felt that if her hands were stretched out and she couldn't look at the girls, she wouldn't be able to use her witchcraft to torment them. Another woman who was on trial was Martha Corey, and during her trial, whenever she bit her lip, the girls claimed she was biting them, and they would actually produce bite marks to show that she was biting them. One of the girls took her shoe off and actually threw it and hit Martha in the head. Another woman, Rebecca Nurse, during the questioning, she put her head down on her chest. She was probably pretty tired. And as she did this motion, some of the girls then jerked their heads and claimed that Rebecca was trying to break their necks through witchcraft by putting her own head down on her chest. One of the cases that got the most attention from neighborhood people was the arrest and trial of the Reverend George Burroughs. Burroughs had once been the minister there, and he had since moved to Maine, so they had to go up to Maine, arrest him, and bring him back to Massachusetts to Salem for trial. By the time Burroughs was taken back to Massachusetts, there was almost no room in the jails to hold him. On May 9th, Burroughs was brought before the court as an initial hearing for questioning, and the girls then, of course, went into their hysterical act when he walked into the room. The testimony they gave was that his dead wives' ghosts had appeared to them and told them that he had murdered them. They also claimed that he had appeared to them and that he had bragged that he had murdered them, and he also bragged that he was no mere witch, but that he was a conjurer or a wizard, and that he was higher than a witch and was actually directing the witchcraft in that part of the world. During this hearing, the girls became so hysterical that they had to be removed from the courtroom and allowed to calm down before they could finish. During his trial on August 5th, the girls produced what appeared to be bite marks on their arms, and they claimed that his specter, the ghost, had bitten them. Of course, that's a good question. How could a spirit bite someone? But that's another matter altogether. As the girls were being questioned by the magistrates, they tried to give their testimony, and during the testimony they had choking sensations in which they weren't allowed to speak, or they were speechless. They behaved as though someone was trying to choke them. The Chief Justice William Stoughton asked Burroughs who he thought was hindering the witnesses, and Burroughs replied that he thought it was the devil. Chief Justice Stoughton then asked Burroughs, "How does the devil so loath to have any testimony borne against you?" In other words, this was Stoughton's way of saying, how is it then that the devil doesn't want these girls to testify against you? And of course, there's no way of really answering that correctly. Other people testified to his extraordinary strength, which could have only been acquired through devilish means. Some of the clergy there, probably feeling like one of their own had strayed, had nothing but antipathy towards him, especially Cotton Mather. But some modern historians have pointed out that because Burroughs was a Baptist, that was probably one of the reasons they didn't like him. Burroughs was convicted, and on August 19th he was executed. The execution took place on Gallows Hill. He was hanged with 4 other people. It's said that after they put the noose around his neck and had him step up on the ladder, he was able to give a few last words, which all of them were allowed to do. He was able to give a prayer and also to recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly, and it was thought that witches weren't able to do that, so people were kind of surprised that he could do that after having been convicted. There's a story, and I don't know if it's true or not, that goes that these 5 people, including Burroughs, were buried so hastily that part of his chin and part of his hand were sticking out of the ground after they buried him. As a side note, more interesting than pertinent, Walt Disney is one of Burroughs' descendants. There was one little comical incident that gives a little humor to the whole tragedy. One man thought that his horse had been stolen and used for joyrides by witches at night, and that his horse was bewitched now. His friend suggested that the way of curing the horse was to get a pipe full of burning tobacco and stick the cool end of the pipe into the horse's rear end. They did this, and apparently a blue flame shot out of the pipe and started a fire in the rafters of his barn. I want to read a list of the people that were convicted and executed for witchcraft during the summer of 1692 as a result of the Salem Witchcraft Trials. On June 10th, Bridget Bishop was hanged. On July 19th, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Wilds were all hanged. On August 19th, George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, George Jacobs Sr., John Proctor, and John Willard were all hanged. On September 19th, Giles Corey was crushed to death. We already talked about him. And on September 22nd, Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Ann Poodeater, William Reed, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardwell were all hanged. As the death toll climbed, and also as the accusations spread, opposition to the proceedings began to grow. One Andover justice of the peace decided he was tired of signing arrest warrants and simply refused to do any more, and not unpredictably, both he and his wife were soon accused of witchcraft. One member of the court, Nathaniel Saltonstall, actually resigned in disgust. He felt the court had gone horribly wrong, and even the new Attorney General, Anthony Checkley, had misgivings about the proceedings. Petitions to the governor began to pile up. In some ways, and perhaps most unsettling, many critics pointed out the non-biblical manner in which the court was proceeding. The court itself seemed to be dabbling in witchcraft and in magic, trying to figure out who these witches were. And after all, since the injunction to not allow witches to live came from the law of Moses in the Old Testament, wasn't that law replaced by the gospel of Jesus Christ? And therefore, why should they even worry about the witches? One critic pointed out that the Bible forbid people to use mediums, and wasn't the court relying on mediums, meaning these girls who were possessed, to get their information to convict people for witchcraft? Other people were uneasy that so many people who had confessed to be witches were being spared, while persons claiming innocence were being executed. The accusations were not only spreading outwards, but they were also spreading upwards, and even Governor Phipps's own wife was accused of witchcraft. On October 29th, the governor disbanded the court of Oyer and Terminer, and no more proceedings were held by it. One wealthy Boston merchant, a man named Robert Califf, who had been highly critical of the proceedings, credited the person who accused the governor's wife of witchcraft for having ended the trials. Chief Justice Stoughton was furious that the court was disbanded. It probably was a huge embarrassment because it called into question the work of the court to begin with. But had the court not been disbanded, many more people would have been executed. Stoughton in particular never met an accused person that he didn't think deserved to be hanged. Healing came slowly. Mothers and daughters, for example, who had accused each other, had to live together and get back to their normal routines. People had died as a result of others' accusations, and they had to meld together as a community again. Bitterness lingered, but there were also signs of healing. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, he publicly apologized for what he had done. In fact, he was the only judge to do so. In a series of acts that has spanned literally 3 centuries, the legislature, or general court at that time as it was called, of Massachusetts, had taken a series of acts to provide compensation as well as setting aside the convictions of the people that were executed. Interestingly, the last group of people to be pardoned were pardoned on October 31st, Halloween night, in 2001 by the acting governor of Massachusetts. This calls into question kind of a legal matter that's really not that important, but it is interesting, since the people were executed under the authority of the Crown, not the United States or the state of Massachusetts, which didn't exist at that time. Shouldn't it have been the Queen's responsibility to pardon these people? It's interesting that no punishment was ever meted out to the judges or the court or anyone involved in it, the accusers or anyone, and I have to wonder about that. I think it's the culture of the people there. They believed witches existed. They probably thought the court had not done a good job or overstepped its boundaries, but they still believed in witchcraft and that witches were bad. I think the trials did much to discredit many of the clergymen who were involved in it. Not all of them agreed with the trials, but one of them, Cotton Mather, who's fawning praise for the judges on the court, I think he fell under some discredit for this. He was convinced that the witch trials and the witchcraft, how it had spread, was one of the signs mentioned in the Bible in Revelations chapter 12, verse 12. He felt that Satan knew he had a little bit of time left and he was trying to do all he could to destroy his godly republic in Massachusetts, and that maybe the second coming was near. Old prejudices die hard. In fact, it's interesting that during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, as they were writing the Constitution, in Philadelphia, one woman was attacked and killed not too many blocks far from where the Constitution was being written for the cause of witchcraft. The famous writer Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was a descendant of John Hawthorne, one of the judges whom we mentioned earlier, tried to apologize for his ancestors' callousness. He wrote in the introduction to his book, The Scarlet Letter, quote, "I know not whether these ancestors of mine bethought themselves to repent and ask pardon of heaven for their cruelties, or whether they are now groaning under the heavy consequences of them in another state of being." I think that the witchcraft trials, had they not been so tragic, would have been hysterically funny. They also revealed just how steeped Puritan culture was in medieval superstition and non-biblical practices. I think the witchcraft trials also gave vigor to a transformation of Puritanism that was already underway. But why did the Salem witchcraft trials happen? How could they happen? Historians, psychiatrists, psychologists, demographers, social activists, and many others have been trying to answer that question. Many of them point out the fact that there were bitter quarrels within Massachusetts society, and certainly those factored in. Certainly the witchcraft trials were a way of evening scores, and they acted as a system of payback, and they facilitated the getting rid of people that were undesirable, because many of the people that were executed were homeless or otherwise disreputable to Puritans, but not all of them. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment, click the like button, and if you haven't already done so, hit the subscribe button. I would love to have you aboard. For further reading, I recommend the following books and articles. The Witches, Salem 1692 by Stacy Schiff. The Salem Witch Trials, a day-by-day chronicle of a community under siege by Marilyn K. Roach. Death in Salem, the private lives behind the 1692 witch hunt by Diane E. Fouds. The Devil in the Shape of a Woman, Witchcraft in Colonial New England by Carol F. Carlson. On Witchcraft by Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather and His Writings on Witchcraft by Thomas J. Holmes, published in the Bibliographical Society of America, 1924, Volume 18, 1924. Adultery or Witchcraft, A New Note on an Old Case in Connecticut by William K. Holdsworth, published in the New England Quarterly, Volume 48, Number 3, September 1975. A Brief History of the Salem Witch Trials by Jess Blumberg, published in the Smithsonian Magazine, October 23, 2017.